Hello, everyone, to Module 6 on existential, person-centered, and Gestalt. So I have just a few opening thoughts before I get into a few of my reactions to the Corey chapters on those theories. I guess first off, just remember this is a 2-week module. So obviously you're covering 3 chapters, 3 different video demonstrations. So I wanted to give you enough time to be able to read and soak that in. And then there's a quiz, and no discussion for these chapters, just a quiz on these ones. The quiz is 15 questions. It comes from a pool of 21 questions. So if you attempt it the first time and don't get the score you want and retake it, that second retake could be different, slightly different than the first attempt. But remember, only the highest attempt will be kept regardless of when it was received. So if the first score was a 95, you're retaking it to 92, you'll have the 95 in the grade book. And then the next thing that I wanted to bring up is the personal values and counseling assignment. So please be thoughtful of this assignment. I really encourage you to start thinking now about the questions that are posed in the syllabus in those 5 different areas so that you can really be reflective for this assignment. I think it's really important to chew on those questions and sit with them to make sense of, what theories might really kind of align with who you naturally are and your beliefs and your positions in life. And then also just as in general as a counselor, just kind of owning our beliefs, owning our values is really important. It helps us to be, pretty transparent with ourselves, and then we can be more, you know, reflective and I guess intentional in our counseling work. So I think those questionnaires are important to chew on and give time to reflect upon that. Then the last thing before I jump into the chapter discussion is I just wanted to remind you that remember that one theory isn't right. One theory isn't best. They're just different. And they have different, philosophies behind them. So when you're applying things to, or different theories to case studies, it's not like, okay, which one is the right one? I need to pick the right one. I'd encourage you to think about, maybe which one's the right one for me, which one feels most natural to me. But you might also feel like which one's best for the client. I think that's where there's going to be just lots of different opinions, based on the person of the counselor and who they are and what approach, would best work for them in working with the client. That answer could be very different. So once again, there's no best approach. Sometimes there's turf wars, and some of these theorists say, oh, this one's better, this one's better, the evidence shows this, the evidence shows that. But in the end, a lot of the evidence ends up showing that they're pretty similar in effectiveness with clients. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there. That it's the goal, at least in this class, isn't to be thinking about which is the right theory, which is the best one. It's more just like which is right for you. Okay, well, I previously recorded my thoughts on existential, person-centered, and gestalts earlier, so you'll switch to a different me. But yeah, thanks, and switching over. Hey everyone, in this portion of the video, I'm going to be talking about existentialism in counseling, the person-centered theory, as well as Gestalt. So a common goal in all of these 3 humanistic existential approaches is that it's not really about reducing symptoms. Sometimes there's approaches that are very much so like, let's focus on symptoms and reducing those symptoms. It's like symptom reduction can be a byproduct, like that can occur, but the shift for the humanistic and existential is that there's a movement towards, we're not just focusing on taking away the unhealthy aspects of life. We're here to enrich life, to really find what's most meaningful, what's most valuable, how can we deeply connect and be who we truly are. So the belief is, as we move into that space of authenticity and of meaningfulness and of, just genuine way of living in the world and experiencing empathy with others, that symptoms will reduce. But it's a movement towards something even greater than that. So I just wanted to first name that as the first key goal of these 3 theories. So let's start with existentialism. There's a lot that's covered in the Corey text, but I'm just going to focus on the existential givens. So Yalom talks about the 4 existential givens of freedom and responsibility, isolation, existential isolation, meaninglessness, and death. So these are basically four givens that are just common in the human experience. No matter who you are, the fact of being human means you face these four givens. So, for example, freedom and responsibility kind of has to do with, that we are free as humans. We don't necessarily choose the situations of our birth, and we're thrown into the world, as Heidegger says, into a context and a culture that isn't of our choosing. But once we're there, we choose. We make the choice of how we're going to respond to life circumstances. And because we're free to choose, that also means that we're responsible for our choices. We're responsible for our experiences. So it brings like with it a sense of ownership. I can own my existence, or at least how I choose to respond in my life. But then that also means I own the consequences of that. Uh, so I guess an example of this, I was working with a student who there was lots of family expectations that were kind of weighing on this student, and this student's cultural way of making sense of this, she was kind of trying to find herself, find her own way in life. Uh, and we in our work together, we started to move towards that. She wanted to move towards kind of embracing her freedom and choosing a direction in life that she wanted to go, and kind of shedding some of those family expectations. But then that brought like a weight, because she's like, okay, I've just been emphasizing what I don't want, these restrictions from family, but now what do I want? So I brought this, this challenge of like this unknown of what do I make of my life now that I've chosen to embrace my own choices. So that kind of speaks to that weight of responsibility. The existential isolation kind of has to do with, ultimately we're alone. Ultimately, we can't be like, we can connect with others. Absolutely. That's kind of what existentialism is about, is finding like an I thou relationship, meaning like a really authentic, that I can truly be myself with another human being to combat that isolation. And in the end, we're a unique person. We're a unique individual. We're isolated from those around us. And this is addressed a bit more on the authenticity of the I thou relationship in the video demonstrations this week. Meaning and meaninglessness. So Yalom basically had this concept of, that we almost confront the meaninglessness of life. Not all existentialisms believe that. Some view it as, that meaning is infused in everything, such as Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl's very, he wrote a book called The Will to Meaning, that's a basic human tendency, is to move towards meaning, that's almost like intrinsic in us, and we have to find it. So that's a big part of existentialism as well, is like kind of finding purpose, finding meaning in life, finding a values-based way of living. Have to keep messing with these things, keep sliding out a little bit. And then death. There's this idea, that there's an anxiety of death, and that it manifests itself in a variety of ways to existentialists. But one example of this is, I have a 53-year-old client that I'm working with, and he often says, I'm 53 and my life isn't where I wanted it to be, and I've just reflected back to him saying, you're starting to feel that life is short, that there's not a lot of time left, and you want to live for the remaining time you have left well. And then he would really embrace that, and like that really resonated for him. So yeah, there's this idea of death almost can call and draw forth meaning. Knowing that life is finite means that there's a time pressure to existence and a time pressure to making life well. For some individuals, like I said. So there's not necessarily techniques in existentialism. It's usually just drawing from various approaches, but with these core philosophical, challenges in mind, making sense of like, okay, I'm using this technique because it's helping this client explore their meaning, because it's addressing their death anxiety. So, for example, a lot of times the core counseling skills that you're learning in that you learn in practicum are going to be a big part of, if you choose an existentialist approach to, making sense of meaning and purpose and death anxiety and existential isolation, through just reflection skills, through the paraphrases we do, through reflecting meaning. What is the client meaning in their statements? What does it feel like to be the client? What's the core existential challenge they're facing. So a lot of times it's just using those core counseling skills to notice those existential themes and addressing them. And a lot of times as clients are going through transitions in life, that'll be an opportunity to address, these givens of existence. All right, I'm going to switch over to person-centered theory now. So person-centered theory is, I think, sometimes pretty misunderstood. It might appear simple, but it doesn't mean that it's simple to practice well and deeply. I'd strongly encourage you to watch the Carl Rogers Counseling Gloria. It's in the supplemental materials for this week, but watching the Carl Rogers as he counsels Gloria, I think is a great example of showing how Rogers, the founder of this approach, really exhibited these core conditions. But the core conditions are three core conditions. So this idea of genuineness or congruence, realness is another synonym there. Then empathy and unconditional positive regard. So having these three conditions present and the client is experiencing them, they're perceiving that from the counselor and they're feeling it internally. This idea is that Rogers wanted to create a facilitative climate. So if those three conditions were present, Rogers believed that the client would naturally move into their potential, would naturally move towards growth, move towards wholeness and healing and existential, meaningful living. So with genuineness, I've described it a little bit. It basically means that as the counselor, that your reactions and feelings and experiences are accessible to you. You're aware of what's happening inside you. And when appropriate, you can use that with the client. So you can involve yourself of how you're feeling towards the client. So for example, there's one client where, it's actually the client that I was referencing before that was trying to kind of shed those family expectations. But the client felt very kind of constricted that she couldn't be honest with her family. And at one point, I almost felt like I wish this client would at some point get mad at me. And I felt that for a while. I felt like, I kind of hope that at some point this client just reacts to me, kind of that transference reaction, so that she could just work through how can I be honest with someone and even be mad at someone and have that be okay. So at one point I said that to her. I said, I've been kind of waiting and kind of wondering and maybe even honestly hoping a little bit that you might get mad towards me at some point. Because sometimes I challenge her and kind of push her a little bit. So I was kind of anticipating that she might be a little bit frustrated or angry with me. But the client never necessarily did address that. But the goal was that I had that piece of awareness inside me, and I chose to chew on it for a while, and I kept feeling it, so I shared it. And so hopefully that opens up the client to say, you know what, I can be real here. The client didn't need to take me up on that invitation to be mad at me. That wasn't the goal. It was just, can I model that the client can be straight with me, that if they have reactions, they can say it. So I think that's one key goal of genuineness, is that experiencing it from the counselor means that you can start to experience genuineness towards yourself and then with others. So empathy, it's a deep emotional understanding. It's a deep resonance with what the client's feeling and experiencing. And Rogers talked about it on page 99 that, when empathy is really being exhibited by the counselors can kind of move around as if they were in the client's experiences. They can kind of feel what it might be like and then express that back to the client. And sometimes they're even, the counselor can even perceive what the experience is like for the client before the client can. So that type of empathy, experiencing that from someone else, can really open the client up to eventually experiencing self-empathy, being able to empathize more with themselves and be open to their feelings, being understanding of what their reactions are. And that insight can then lead to a lot of change and growth. So, a lot of you feel statements, the feeling reflections, even, reflecting meaning can be important as well. And then the last core condition of unconditional positive regard. This has to do with, sometimes this is pretty misunderstood, in my opinion, my experience. It's warmth, it's a caring for the client, it's an openness, like a non-possessive acceptance of the client and the personhood of the client. It's a deep trust in the client, trusting that they know where they need to go, that I don't need to direct them. that I can just help facilitate a climate, once again, where they can be open and honest and genuine, where they can experience empathy, and then where they can trust in themselves and accept themselves as they are, not needing to be different than they are. So on page 98 of the Rogers article, the necessary and I forgot the necessary and sufficient conditions. I think that's the name of the title or something like that. Rogers stated that, unconditional positive regard has to do with, when you feel neither approval nor disapproval of the client and their statements, simply acceptance. So it's not about agreeing. It's not about disagreeing. It's just about, I can embrace you wherever you're at. I can embrace you. So what I've learned from these core conditions is, as they're experienced in the relationship with the counselor, they begin to move towards being experienced outside of the counseling relationship. I think that's a big power of the core conditions and of the person-centered approach. Is it transforms how the client has a relationship towards themselves and then with others. But there's this idea with Carl Rogers that he talked about, that he viewed these core conditions as necessary and sufficient for client growth. That's a big statement. That's basically saying that these conditions are necessary for clients to grow, but it's also sufficient. So nothing else needs to be present. So that really challenges a lot of other theories that you take kind of an active role in needing to guide and teach and use psychoeducation, teach coping skills. Basically, Rogers is saying, nope, that's not necessary. To experience these conditions fully, not necessarily fully as in to a perfect degree at all times, but to feel them enough and have the client experience them regularly, implies that that's enough. The client will naturally grow. Okay, the last theory of Gestalt. A few things that I just want to emphasize is that, the Gestalt really emphasizes a present moment focus. And often that's just like very present focus on body language and noticing what's happening in the room. When I say this word, how do you respond? It focuses on the process of the client's experience rather than the content. So it's not the Gestalt counselor is not necessarily going to really emphasize, what are they saying? What's the story that the client's focusing on? But like, how are they talking about it? How are they in the room with me right now? So it's not really focusing on what's happening out there in the client's existence, but it's like right here between us. So it has this I thou type relationship as well. This really authentic interaction where the client and the counselor are hoping to be whole humans with each other. And a big part of it as well is, helping the client experience catharsis, just really being able to emotionally express and gain insight from that expression, to then also be able to own their feelings and be aware of them. And back to the whole person focus, a lot of times clients have unfinished business, meaning that they have emotional baggage that they've been carrying, emotional weight that they've been carrying around with them for some time, and they haven't yet been able to release it. But carrying that baggage means that it's holding them back from being more fully them, from being a whole person and who they're kind of meant to be. And so this unfinished business allows them to kind of work through what are some of these parts that are unmet or that are creating friction in the client's life, and how to work through those parts of their lives that are difficult, so that they can move towards integrating into a whole. And in the video demonstration, they talk about the top dog and the underdog. So the client is kind of working through that part. The part of them is the top dog, a part of them is this underdog, and working through some unfinished business to move towards wholeness in a relationship with a family member. So in the end, there's this idea in Gestalt that, the organism, the individual, is seeking equilibrium, is seeking self-regulation, is seeking to be whole and to regulate the self in a positive way to move towards their potential. The Gestalt counselors are often very, I don't know, it depends on which Gestalt counselors we're talking about. So Fritz Perls, the founder of this approach, was somewhat abrasive. In the Gloria video that I have posted, where he counseled Gloria as well as Carl Rogers, he's pretty challenging. He kind of
goes after the client, doesn't confronts big time to the point of getting the client upset and angry. But that was somewhat of the goal, to help the client to not have to hide behind pleasantries, but to just to be honest. So, but then there's other people in Gestalt that kind of push back against that approach, saying, the counselor doesn't have to be so abrasive. A counselor can be more warm and understanding, as well as, very present and in the moment with the client. But some of the techniques that are often used is, like I mentioned, confrontation, to kind of help pull the client towards authenticity. Uh, Also, this idea in the Corey text, talking about experiments. So trying out emergent and creative adventures of sorts and ideas. So kind of trying out these hypotheses of what it would be like to be different in the present moment with the client. So it's kind of like this, if the kind of trying out these experiments in the counseling relationship, and then encouraging experiments outside of how to move towards greater wholeness and honesty outside of the counseling relationship. One other technique that I think is important to reference is the empty chair technique. So the empty chair technique is basically where there's an empty chair, and whatever the issue that the client's working on, maybe with a family member or with a part of themselves, they talk to that individual or part of themselves as if they were in the room with them in the chair, using present moment and present tense language. So that can often be a really powerful, it might sound kind of strange, kind of like an actor might do something like that, but it can often be a way of moving towards catharsis, of really expressing pent up feelings. I've seen individuals use this and have conversations with family members who have passed away and died. So they've been able to kind of resolve this unfinished business by talking in the present tense to this person as if they were in the empty chair. So it usually needs to be done in a, with the counselor there, who can facilitate that and then kind of help the client come out of that experience and process things, so they're not just kind of left in a deeply emotional space. So anyways, those are some of my thoughts on these theories. Not a comprehensive list at all, but I think the 3 chapters from Corey will also go into more detail there, as well as the video demonstrations to kind of touch on other points. But those are some key areas that I wanted to emphasize. So thanks for watching.